The second big takeaway from that first example we worked on was the number of conventions that we used. Recall that we said ASP.NET MVC by default uses convention over configuration in order to provide a very productive workflow for application development. The trick is that you have to know the conventions in order to get started. And so let's start back at the beginning here. What is a convention? What is a configuration? A convention is simply an agreed upon standard. This is something that's implicit in nature. We don't have to explicitly decide or explicitly state how something should work. It just works by convention. There's some automatic things built in if we follow the convention. So we followed the conventions of ASP.NET MVC, and it gave us a little boost in productivity. It made the workflow a little bit more elegant, a little more streamlined. A configuration is a setting, typically a setting in a configuration file that's read by your code or by the MVC framework or by some third-party assembly, like, for example, the Entity Framework. It needs to know where you want to connect and how you want it to function. All right, so this is something that's very explicit in nature. We have to explicitly define how a given feature should work, where it should find resources, and then we record that decision inside of a configuration file, typically in some file format like XML or JSON or something of that nature. So when we rely on conventions over configurations, we follow file and folder naming rules and locations, as well as class and method naming rules, in order to work more quickly and orderly. Now, in that previous lesson, we followed a bunch of conventions and we were able to move quickly. You might say, oh, I can't remember. What conventions were you talking about here? Well, first of all, we needed to create a controller that was called home controller. Do you remember that? I said you got to change the name, not default controller. It's going to look for the home controller in the root of the website whenever a request comes in for the root of the website. So the term home was important. The ASP.NET MVC engine looked for that particular controller with the name home, and furthermore, it even looked for a specific action result method. We'll call that talk about that in one moment. So that's one convention. Not only that, but our controller had to have the suffix controller. So not only do we need to name it home, but we needed to name it home controller in order for the MVC framework to know that we intended for this class to be a controller, specifically the home controller. Not only that, but here we get back to that index. The name of the action result method was indexed because, after all, we're creating a method to handle incoming requests for the root of the website. And in Apache or IIS or other web servers, typically index.html or default.html, those were the old standard default file names that would be utilized whenever you were looking into the root or some subfolder for a given website. Then recall, because we had an action result method called index, we right-clicked and said, go ahead and create a new view, or go to view, I guess. Add view was what we selected there at the top. And it created a folder, or rather a file for us, and that called our attention to the fact that there was a home folder created for us by convention whenever we created the home controller. Furthermore, for the index action method, it created for us by default an index.cshtml file as the view associated with our, with our home controller's index action method. Okay, so hopefully you can see the relationship here between the name of the controller, home, and the folder in the views directory, home, the name of the action result method, index, and the name of the view, index.html. Not only that, but also whenever we saw the index.cshtml file, Notice that the file name was .cshtml, which we understood that to mean a combination of C# and HTML. And I said at the time that that file extension was important because it told the ASP.NET MVC runtime that it would work with the Razor View engine as opposed to a file extension of ASPX, which would indicate to the runtime that it should work with the ASPX view engine. So it's important to know that we don't necessarily have to follow those conventions. We could replace these conventions by creating our own implementation of core ASP.NET MVC components that rely instead on configuration. However, that's an advanced topic, and frankly, I'm not sure why you'd actually want to do that. But this does highlight one of the design goals that we talked about in the previous lesson. One of the design goals of ASP.NET MVC's framework, and that is the pluggability. If you don't like how Microsoft implemented some core piece of the framework, you can replace it with your own. Changing view engines is probably one of the most common examples of pluggability. So besides the ASPX and the Razor View engines, there's also a number of them available out there through NuGet or GitHub. Furthermore, you could change how controllers work, change how the default conventions work, and so on. But that is the idea of the design principle of convention over configuration and why it's adopted. It helps us to move more quickly. It gives us some direction on where things should go. It handles a lot of details implicitly so that we don't have to explicitly state them in some configuration file. Okay, so that's great. We'll continue this process of better understanding MVC through the little project we created in the next video. Thanks.